Hey guys, I'm back again just a few hours later, and I wanted to kind of give you an insider point of view about how the mainstream media 100% bungled the Danny Masterson trial verdict. And by association, how I have to own up to something, how I sort of, although less so than the New York Post who made the biggest bungle, how I sort of bungled the Danny Masterson verdict as well. So I sneakily, or not sneakily because I'm telling you guys about it, but I changed the title of my last video and edited out the part where I said there was a desire for him to get 30 years to life because Danny Masterson did get 30 years to life. Now, on the prosecuting part, there would be a stronger desire to probably get 40 or 50 years to life, but they still got 30 years to life versus simply 30 years. Now, I did note in that video, unlike in the New York Post, that he is most likely expected to serve most of the 30 years, and perhaps even beyond that. So I was correct about that, where the New York Post was kind of more final, but you have to understand the court terminology. And there was a reporter in the New York Post, and I thought that was a trustworthy source, mainstream media, they've usually been pretty accurate. There was a reporter who simply did not get the accurate information on file. And I'll kind of explain the process for being a journalist from an insider's point of view about how these verdicts can be bungled. And it really puts a spotlight on the level of priority the New York Post had on this story. And I'm considering the New York Post mainstream news, obviously. Usually what happens is each newspaper, if they're lucky, who wants to cover a specific case, could get one reporter to sit in the courtroom and write everything down. They have to write everything down because no recording is allowed, no cell phones are allowed. You have to even give your cell phone to the security gentleman up front, so you can't even bring your phone in or try to surreptitiously record anything. With that, and with the trial not being recorded at all for later reference, all of the journalistic information conveyed to you is simply from the people that were there, and hopefully the people that were taking effective notes. The New York Post rushed to get this verdict out, and they got the verdict incorrect. They said sentenced to 30 years. And you could see this web effect, because when you report on a story, let's say you work for a mainstream news source, and the story is low priority. If this were the Idaho murder cases, for example, the New York Post would have sent an experienced court reporter to cover that because they feel that that story would get more attention. Unfortunately, because Masterson might be considered washed up to many people, he was last in that 70s show in Yellowstone, the New York Post saw this case as low priority. Therefore, they did not send an experienced court reporter in to actually cover the case. And that is a huge issue, and that's why that information was incorrect, because the language in court is almost a different language. I say, aside from actual languages, there are two other languages that are almost alien to an English speaker or any other language speaker, which is the language of HTML and the language of court. So this reporter, and I was looking at the reporter's history, this reporter had no experience covering court. What the New York Post saw is they had to cover this case as it was necessary, as there'd be some media, but it was low priority, and they did not put any expertise or an expert court reporter onto the scene, and therefore didn't actually care about being inaccurate. And I say they didn't care because it's interesting. You watch the New York Post, and this is before Aaron or Tony Ortega, and you might have some reservations about him, but I think towards the end of the court case, he's covered it accurately. Before Tony Ortega or Aaron, it was just the New York Post. And then all of a sudden I saw NBC News also said he was sentenced to 30 years, not 30 years to life. And then another mainstream news source, I think it was Fox, said Danny Masterson sentenced to 30 years. Those two sources have since corrected themselves. The New York Post cares so little, and I have some admiration for the Post. It hurts me to say this because they did a nice article about me and my firing from Scientology. My sister-in-law, interestingly enough, also works for the New York Post, so I have a connection there, although the way I got the New York Post story was not through her. She didn't want to touch it, so that was an external thing, understandably. So I have an admiration for the Post, but they were the leaders because they actually sent somebody in. So, for example, NBC or these other organizations might not have sent anybody in, and the person writing that print article would just look at the one mainstream reporter and assume that what the mainstream reporter said was fact. So the New York Post prints all this, and then 3 other media sources follow, citing the incorrect verdict. Then, about an hour later, after Aaron releases his video, NBC changes their headline to 30 years to life versus just 30 years, as do the other 2 sources. So once they realized they got it wrong, they made the correction. The New York Post, though, cares so little about this that they haven't even corrected it. So that's kind of interesting to see, but that's how court works. The media source will send somebody in, and if that media source is verified and trusted, then about 30 other people very lazily will just look at the one article and essentially copy and paste and rearrange the words. 90% of the Masterson trial will not have any original reporting. Most of it, if you see it on mainstream news, will essentially be sourced either from the Daily Mail, which was detailed, or for a basic rundown from the New York Post, which at least that part was not inaccurate. Other parts seem to be accurate, but that was the main part. So I want to own up, certainly, to me trusting the Post and assuming they got the verdicts correct, and then sneakily switching it, although, again, I'm talking with all of you guys, so I'm not being sneaky about it. But I want to own up to that, although I did recognize that it was a minimum of 30 years. As I did mention, it was a minimum of 30 years. I thought the sentencing was strange, but I thought, well, maybe that's a hard minimum. But 30 years to life is obviously different. So I got that wrong because I relied on the New York Post. Then I changed it in the video and changed the title and edited out the part that was incorrect. Here's the part that is correct, though. I said, unlike the New York Post, that he is likely to get 30 years, probably not any bit less than that, although there is a chance that he could get less than 30 years. And I say that with it either being just 30 years, a 30-year sentence, then there's a very good chance you can get out in 10 years. But with a 30-year minimum, in the state of California, and I figure this because of old age, the state of California, you could actually get out before your sentence. So we're gonna read together the letter of the law, so we could all follow along. This is from the state website, California Court. Elderly parole eligible date. Remember, Danny Masterson is 47 years old at the moment. It's interesting. The date determinably and indeterminably sentenced offenders are eligible for a parole hearing once they have served 25 years of incarceration and have reached the age of 60. So this is interesting. What is the determinately and indeterminately sentenced offenders? That means Masterson has been determinately sentenced, minimum of 30 years. But it doesn't matter. They're saying either or, once they're 60, are eligible for a parole hearing once they have served 25 years of incarceration and have reached, that's important, the age of 60. So, very likely, I would say, Danny Masterson will get let off after 25 years because he'll be 72, give or take, by the time that this eligibility, that 25 years of incarceration, rolls along. It doesn't matter that he's been sentenced to a minimum of 30 years. The fact that this is something that people say I got wrong, which is actually right. There's a reason for the defense team, for the Masterson defense team, to be optimistic about this verdict. Because this eligibility, 25 years, is not that different than the 30 years that he got. He got 30 years to life. Masterson did not get 50 years to life. If Masterson got 50 years to life, and then you were looking at the 25 years of incarceration, reach 60, well, you could still do that, but you have all these extra years left. Versus, if you only have 5 years left, the judge on the parole board might deem it reasonable. Okay, you're only five years short. It actually gets worse, though. This was based on the 3-judge panel's 2014 court order. Offenders sentenced to life without the possibility of parole are condemned or excluded, which is not them. But it says, effective January 1st, 2021, so this recently happened, determinately and indeterminately sentenced offenders will be eligible for a parole hearing once they have served 20 years of incarceration and have reached the age of 50 under Chapter 334 of the Statutes of 2020. So the state sort of just contradicted itself. And this is why law is a completely different language. And I'll be talking with Jeff Augustine, who has actual experience in law, and Graham Barry, who will know this off the top of his head. But this is why law and the language of the law and reporting the law in an accurate way is a challenge. The best guess that I could guess from this, not being an attorney and not having a law degree, but covering some court and obviously being inaccurate more than once, it appears he could get off as early as 20 years from now. 20 years of incarceration and have reached the age of 50. So, Danny Masterson, that seems to be the newest. The old rule seemed to be 25 years, 60 years old. The new rule seems to be 50 years old, 20 years. Remember, in politics, there's a lot of criminal justice reform efforts, especially in the state of California, which tends to lean more left. So that would make sense. So it's entirely possible 20 years from now, when Masterson is 67, he'll get released. I would say, just looking at the top of this, and listen to Aaron and listen to some other people who have more of an expertise on this specific trial, because he'll be talking with some experts. But looking at the letter of the law and the sentencing, give him a 50% chance of being released after 20 years. My opinion, I would give him a 75% chance of being released after 25 years, which means that Masterson would be 72 years old, which means he would not spend his life in prison. He'll spend the rest of his middle agehood in prison, certainly. But tragically, which I think is pretty unfair, tragically, that's the extent of it. So wanted to just bring all of this up. Again, own up to yet another mistake that I made, although again, largely I was correct and I did indicate it was unlikely he'd get anything significantly less than 30 years, and that 30 years was the minimum. New York Post reported just that 30 years, essentially handed with the rest of the details that the 30 years would be the maximum. So that is not true. So I kind of saved myself in my own stupidity of the law, forgetting there was a big difference between getting sentenced just X years and X years to life. But I made that inaccuracy because I rushed to get the video out there, and I trusted the New York Post, and the New York Post is incorrect. And as you can see, they still have not corrected the sentencing. They don't seem to care. So again, this is a very eye-opening moment in terms of what the mainstream media cares about and the efforts of accuracy they will put in for what specific story they may or may not care about. And there is a bit of a media blackout here because the New York Post did not put the effort to get a reporter that was experienced and trained with court. They're a mainstream media organization. They could easily pay somebody. They could have a guest person fly out there, whatever. They did not put in the effort for that. And because of that, there's a blackout. That's what I was trying to do when I was a news anchor in Yuma. There was a media blackout with the death of Lisa Marie Presley, and nobody mentioned her heroic role for being willing to testify against the Church of Scientology despite the repercussions. As somebody who felt was a responsible journalist or was trying to be, I thought that was important to put in. But other mainstream sources, it was a cursory glance. And essentially, a lot of these mainstream media sources will be covering the Masterson trial. They'll be pulling probably a lot from Tony Ortega as well as from Aaron. I know some fans of Aaron have their own set of emotions or viewpoints about Tony, which I get. That's a conversation I'm not involved in. But if you want the most accurate information, I'll give you some great analysis. I'll give you some great interviews once the dust is settled. We're able to chew on how many years Masterson is getting. But if you want the details, and the most accurate details, I'd say go to Aaron or go to Tony, because I looked at what they posted after the trial, and both of it seems to be well informed and accurate. But yes, that is the inside view. No cameras in the courtroom. You're writing everything down. You better hope you know the language. You better hope you didn't miss a word. And the New York Post wasn't vigilant enough to really care that they did get it wrong, ultimately. But you saw the spiral. And that's the inside perspective as to how this spiral gets sent. One dude, one day in his job, essentially just running out the clock, getting paid for somebody. Well, I guess I have to be the one to do it. I was looking at this gentleman's history, no history of covering Scientology or Danny Masterson or any of that. And because the issue was low priority on the New York Post list. So I'm hoping in the YouTube videos and everything else that the mainstream media will realize there's a lot to chew on, and there's a lot more than just Danny Masterson was declared guilty. So hopefully this might set the record straight after getting the record a little bit wrong, but not as wrong as the New York Post did. So thanks for looking out. Take care.